Good morning, everyone. I know it takes a second for people on live to see me, so I'm gonna wait till I see that little icon change. All right, I think we're good. How's everybody doing today? Can y'all see me yet? Thank you, Kat. All right, excellent. We'll go ahead and get started because it's hard for me to fit this in an hour because I talk so much about everything. So we are going to do questions at the end. If you want to hold your questions until the end, that'll make it easier for me to find them. And yeah, we'll dive right in. So I am Sarah. I'm a literary agent at the Tobias Literary Agency. If you want to read more about my wish list, you can go to sarahnfisk.com. And I am open the first 5 days of every month for 2025. So I'll be opening again soon and have a 5-day window. I represent middle grade young adult fiction. Hey, Danny. And adult commercial fiction. So adult commercial genre fiction, sorry. So science fiction, fantasy, romance, mystery thriller, book club fiction, women's fiction, and I don't do horror. And then I also represent a narrow range of nonfiction. I'm also a published author. I publish traditionally, I've self-published, and I've published with a small press. I'm one of the founders of Disability in Publishing. I host the podcast Queries, Qualms, and Quirks, where traditionally published authors share their successful query letter and their journey to publication. It is on a hiatus, but there's 3 seasons there for you to listen to if you haven't started yet. I used to work as a book publicist, a publicity director, and an editorial assistant. And then I was a Book Riot contributor for many years. And then I was Pitchfork's mentor and board member and officer. And so even before I was literary agent, I was receiving queries in a variety of different ways. And so I've been reading and critiquing and teaching about queries for a very long time. Here are some of my clients' books. Dreadful by Caitlin Rozakis, New York Times bestseller. Embroidery of Souls by Ruby Martinez is a YA fantasy. Comes out this fall. That Librarian is a memoir about book banning, and that came out last year and comes out in paperback in the fall. And then Just Another Meet Cute by Jen Wen, which came out this year, and that's a YA contemporary romance. So I represent a variety of genres. I always like to give this little note about submission reading and queries. Every agent reads differently and weighs elements differently. And so something that may not be a big deal for me may be like really important to another agent and vice versa. I always like to try to distinguish when I am sort of saying what I like versus what agents in general don't like. But sometimes it is hard to tell, so feel free to ask. So a lot of people think that we sort of like read queries looking for a reason to say no. And that if you make like one little tiny mistake, that's the reason, and we're just going to reject you for a tiny mistake. And for most of us, I don't think that's true. I think most of us are reading looking for a reason to say yes. We're looking for books that we can champion and represent. And so we're not reading queries just like hoping that we're able to say no to everyone. We're hoping we're able to say yes to them. And I think that's important whenever you're querying and putting your query together is like the tiny, tiny little tweaks or whatever. They're really not that big of a deal. So, yeah. So just from zero, what is a query letter? It is, hey Jay, it is a single page cover letter introducing you and your book to an agent or editor. In order to do this, the book must be 100% complete and polished. There are some exceptions to this rule, but if this is your first query class, those exceptions probably don't apply to you. That's usually people who are very well-established authors often will query on proposal. It is a formal business letter, even when in email form, so I think it's important to keep that in mind. The four main components of a query letter is the basic book info, or some people call this the metadata paragraph. We're going to dive more into that in a minute. the summary of the book, the author bio, and the closing. And the closing is very, very short. Queries these days are only sent via email or via an online form. Someone the other day in a different workshop was saying that they were emailing or they were mailing, but they couldn't find very many publishers that would take queries via mail. And that's true. Everyone's moved to email. So yeah, there aren't very many places that will do a mailed query. So in your basic book info paragraph, you're going to want to include category and genre. Does anyone watching know the difference between category and genre? Danny, do you know? I don't mean to call you out, but I always like to ask people. Wait for those comments to come in. I think everyone knows what genre is, but I do get query letters. Categories where it can tell. Yeah, that's an interesting way to phrase it. Categories, age, genre is like mystery, fantasy. Yeah. So the way I always usually say is like category is more about the audience and genre is more about the content. You trust Jay. So category is things like adult, middle grade, young adult. Those are not genres. Those are categories that hold multiple genres within them. And then genres are things like mystery, fiction. They are also things like memoir and cookbook. Those are also genres in the nonfiction realm. And so if you don't put a category, it is assumed that is an adult, but otherwise you need to put your category in there. And then you need to put your word count in there. Round to the next 1,000 words. There's no reason to put all the digits in there. The title of the book, you can put that in all caps to make it stand out. And then the other thing is like if you do have a series or you want it to be a series and the book does stand alone, the thing that you sort of want to say is standalone with series potential. You could just say it's a standalone, if it is, and that's true, go for that. But in general, publishers aren't really investing in series right now. And so trying to sell like a whole series together is difficult unless you end up in a competitive situation. So here's an example of what this paragraph might look like about my client's book that just came out. The Grimoire Grammar School Parent-Teacher Association is a contemporary fantasy satire, complete at 90,000 words, and can be pitched as Big Little Lies Goes to Magic School. So we're going to put the comp titles in there as well. People get really stressed out about comp titles. I think that you should not stress out about them as much as you want. There are agents who feel differently, who think that comp titles are the end-all be-all. So. And then I'm going to talk about the bio, even though it usually goes intro paragraph, summary, bio, and closing. We're going to talk about the bio first because it's so much shorter and we're going to spend a lot more time on the summary. So I just want to get it sort of out of the way before we move on. Yeah, so the bio doesn't have to be long for fiction writers. Usually it's like 1 to 2 sentences for most fiction writers. Agents vary on what they want. I think that if you don't really have a lot to put in here, that I don't care if it's there or not, honestly. The book is the most important thing to me. You want to include any writing organizations that you belong to. If you go to like the same conference every year, you can put that in there as well. If you have publication credits, you can put those in there. And that includes like if you're writing fiction and you've been you've published like nonfiction articles or whatever in good outlets and legitimate outlets, you can still put those in there. If you do any sort of blogging or podcasting or YouTubing, anything like that, you might want to mention it there. Anything that shows you take writing seriously. Another thing that you might want to put on here is if you have a personal connection to an element of your story. So for example, if your book isn't about an adoptee, and you are an adoptee, that's a good thing to put sort of in the bio section. some people will say something like, Kat's experiences in the book are based on my experiences as an adoptee or something like that. All right. Summary. Okay, so this is the big part of it. This is what we're going to spend most of the time on today. The summary portion should introduce the premise, a main character or two, generally, what happens in the book. And I know that seems obvious, but there are a lot of queries that don't say what happens in the book. And then I'm going to be saying these words a lot, probably conflict and stakes. And we're going to learn more about what that means in a minute. The summary should end right when the story gets juicy. Often people will say, you explain what happens up until about the midpoint and then hint at what is to happen after that. You definitely want to leave on like a high interest part. That's when you want to stop. The summary in the query letter should not be a synopsis. A synopsis is a different document, and a synopsis explains what happens from beginning to end with all spoilers. And so if an agent asks for a synopsis, that is going to be separate from your query letter. Your query letter reads like back cover copy. The main goal of the summary is to convince the agent or editor or whoever it is, even if you're writing for a reader audience, if you're self-publishing, it's to convince them to want to read more. That's it. That's all that the summary has to do. And then it's usually about 100 to 250 words, depending on complexity. And this is just the summary portion. You have the other parts of your query that are going to make it a little bit longer. Usually I try not to go over 200 words if possible. The ones that are going to need to go over that are the ones with a lot of world building. You need to explain a lot of world building. Those are sometimes longer, but always try to make it as short as you can while still getting everything across. So there are two methods I like to use. That these are the questions that your query should answer. And the one on the left, the 4 questions, is for plot-focused books or even character-driven books with a strong plot. And then this one on the right is for books that are truly character-driven. Like often this is for literary novels, or just like very sort of upmarket books that don't have a strong plot. So who is your main character? And that is not just like, what is their name? It's like, give us a little glimpse into what kind of person they are, right? What do they want? And this is the main want of the story, which may be different from what they want on page 1, but the main sort of thing that's driving the story forward. What stands in the way of them getting what they want? And this is your conflict. That's the definition of conflict for fiction. And then what happens specifically if they don't get it? And these are stakes. And then if in the character-driven model, the questions are, who is the protagonist? And again, like, don't just name them, like give us a real glimpse into the kind of person they are, especially for a character-driven novel. What choice do they face? This is the main choice that is driving the story forward in a character-driven novel. And 3, what are the consequences of the choice? So what choice do they face is the conflict. It's an internal conflict usually. And what are the consequences is stakes. All right, so here's a quite basic format. In the handout, you do have a version of this too. So you can refer to that as well. And this is going to be on 2 slides. So this is only the first half. So dear agent name, title is a genre. Sometimes you're going to want to put category in there, especially if you're writing young adult or younger. Complete at so many thousand words that will appeal to fans of Comp 1 and Comp 2. There are multiple different ways you can do comps. This is one of them. I'm querying you because personalization. I don't think personalization is that very, very important unless there is something in my wish list that is not immediately apparent in that first couple of sentences that you want to mention. So one of my things is like, I really love a like really complicated, unhinged sibling relationship. And if that's not immediately obvious in the opening couple sentences here, then that's something you should probably put in this personalization section. There are agents who feel differently, and they feel like every query should be personalized to every agent. So just keep that in mind. Character is identifying characteristic and establish their status quo is what we're doing here. Maybe another sentence or two of setup or world building if you need it. If you have a second character and it's dual POV, then you introduce the second character next. This is very common setup for a romance, for example. When inciting incident happens, character must face these obstacles or conflicts in order to obtain these goals. This can be a couple sentences. I write it out like this. It's one sentence. It's probably a couple other sentences. If they don't, the stakes will happen, right? And obviously this is shortened down and a little glib, but this is the main sort of format. And then your bio. I'm a profession from place and am I insert membership, publications, etc. If you have a personal connection to the story, mention it here. When I say closing, this is it. Thank you for your time and consideration. Sincerely, name. That's it. That's all you need to put on there. There's no reason to put, the manuscript is available upon request. You can put it in there. It's not a big deal. But if you are, querying, we assume the manuscript is available. There's no reason to put anything in here like, I look forward to hearing back from you, anything like that. Queries, we want to keep them as concise as possible. And so a lot of the sort of formalities that you might think might help will just get skipped over. So there's really no reason to put them in there. All right. So here are some tips for an enticing summary portion. It should read like back cover copy of a book. Very, very similar. The way that a query is written and the way that back cover copy is almost exact. I've written, they're not query letters, but when we pitch to editors, we write something that's very much like a query letter. And I've had editors take that and change a couple of things, and that's becomes a cover copy. So they're very, very similar. They should make the tone, the world, the plot, and the main characters known. And the thing that is most often missing in queries is the tone. And this isn't like a lot of really heavy voice work. It's more subtle. It's more about word choice. And just making sure that, if you have sort of a serious murder mystery, whatever, that the cover letter isn't like light and fluffy or vice versa, right? We just want to make sure we're setting the stage for the pages. It should be specific and unique. Probably the most common critique that I give on query letters whenever I do query letter critiques is be more specific. And I think I have an example of some things in a couple minutes of the way things are not so specific sometimes. Conflict and stakes. Conflict and stakes are the two most important things. They are the reason why readers stay for a story. They're the reason why readers get invested in a story. So we need to make sure that those are clear in the cover letter. I have colleagues who almost every time they read a cover letter or a query letter, they're like, where's the stakes? Where's the stakes? Where are the stakes? Because that is what is going to get a reader invested. It should be as concise as possible. I know I mentioned that before. Excuse me. But query letters are often being read pretty quickly. They're being skimmed a lot of the time. I can't skim, but that's what people tell me. They're often read like in between other tasks. Like I love to read query letters whenever I am in line waiting for something because I love reading them on my phone. Just the format really works for me. But it needs to be as concise as possible. Read back cover copy for books in your genre and see what works. And this is what I recommend if you, every time someone's like, oh, I have this like very weird situation, or, I have an unreliable narrator, for example, or my book's not linear or something like that. Find books that are published that have those elements and see how they have written out this pitch copy, because you're going to want to learn from the way that they've done it. You want to hint at secrets to be revealed while being as specific as you can. It's a delicate balance. I'm saying it very easy, but I know it's not very easy to do. And then you want to avoid cliches as much as possible. And I definitely have some examples coming up for y'all on the cliches that we see in query letters all the time. There you go. So here's some sort of 101, some entry-level mistakes. One is the author didn't follow submission guidelines. I have very extensive submission guidelines. Other agents may have shorter submission guidelines than me. But if they have any out, make sure you're following them. Make sure you're also just following the norms of querying. You should only query, one book at a time, that kind of thing. The book is not a genre that the agent represents. This happens more than you would like to know. Even with, I use Query Manager and I select the genres that you can submit to me, and people will select an incorrect genre and query me, and then in the query say, oh, well, you didn't have this genre, so I just selected something else. And that's because I don't accept that genre, right? So you're not going to be the exception for that agent. You don't even want an agent who doesn't accept your genre, because what that means is they don't know any editors who take that genre. So yeah, make sure you're only submitting to agents who accept your genre. The query doesn't say what the book is about. This is very, very common. It will focus on the reasons why the author wrote the book, the things that they hope readers will take away from it, but then we never actually learn what the book is about. It's way out of accepted word count range for your genre. And if you are ever curious about what kind of word count range there are for different genres, I do have a post on my website. So if you go to the links that Kat's been sharing from my website, on the sidebar, there's a sort of list of resources for writers. And one of those is a word count thing. And it's very, very important to only look towards debut authors, because people will say all the time, well, Brandon Sanderson, blah, blah, right? He has, I don't know how long his books are. I think some of them are over 500,000 words. And Brandon Sanderson can do whatever he wants because readers trust him and they'll buy it anyway. But as a debut author, you're not given the same leeway. You're not given the same trust that a well-established author is. So whenever you're looking for examples of what you can do, only look at debut authors, because well-established authors have different rules from debut authors. Don't query more than one book at a time. There's one exception to this, and that is if you're a picture book author and you and the agent has specifically said to include more than one book in a pitch. Sometimes that does happen. But other than that, you should only be querying one book. You can send a book to one agent and a different book to another agent, but only one book per agent per time. And you just have to make sure you're keeping track of who you're submitting to, because a lot of agencies will have, you can only submit to one agent at a time sort of rule. And that, if you have, that's one query at a time, no matter how many books there are. So you can't query me with one book and Steffi with another book. That's against our rules. Not knowing the difference between a query and a synopsis, this happens quite a bit. So a query reads like back cover copy. It goes to about the midpoint and teases the rest. A synopsis tells full spoilers, beginning to end, the entire plot arc and the entire character arc. And so I request a synopsis in my submissions, and I often get a query copy. The people just copy and paste the query in there. And that's not what I'm asking for in a synopsis, and vice versa. Sometimes, less often, but sometimes people will put what's more like a synopsis in the query, and they tell the full ending, and you don't do that in a query. A fiction query written in first person. So a query should always be written in third person, no matter what the book is written in. And that is partially so we don't feel like sort of jolted by your query, and another part of it is so we can really make sure we're distinguishing between you as the author and the character. And when we get fiction queries written in first person, they are very disconcerting. They can be very disconcerting because they are often, the people who do this often are trying to do it for like to be catchy or whatever, and it is a lot of times it's like a serial killer or something. So it's very disconcerting. So don't do it. Query should always be written in third person. All right, here are some do's and don'ts. Do follow submission guidelines. I know I mentioned this a couple of times, but it is very important. It's the easiest way to sort of disqualify yourself. Do address the agent by name. So you can always write dear first name if you are not entirely sure how that person prefers to be addressed with it in terms of what is it called, salutations. You can do dear first name. It's perfectly okay. I promise. A lot of people, especially people who are my age and older, do have a resistance to doing dear first name, but I promise you it's okay, unless the agent has specifically requested that you address them another way. I specifically request on my query form that you address me dear Sarah, and I probably get, I would say like 20% of the queries I get disregard that. Don't behave as if you're the exception. You might be, you could be the next Michael Crichton or whatever, right? But don't act as though you are. Even if you are an incredible writer, still making sure that you're following the rules and like doing what you're supposed to do is the best way to get people interested in working with you. Don't be overly informal. So don't like chat with the agent like your friends. Don't talk about their family for sure. That's weird. If they post on Instagram or whatever, don't talk about the way that they look, that kind of thing. Don't give away the ending in the query letter. That's for the synopsis. Do match the book's writing style, but again, still always in third person. And so if the book is really funny, the query letter should be a little funny. If the book is really intense, the query letter should be quite intense. Don't editorialize. So editorializing is whenever you write something about your book that a reviewer might write about your book. So something like, this is a fast-paced thrill ride, that kind of thing. This is definitely a situation where you should show and don't tell. So don't tell me that your book is hilarious, right? Make the writing itself hilarious. Make the query itself hilarious. And people hate to be told that something is funny. Like, I feel like a lot of people have that reaction where someone is like, oh my God, watch this video. It's so funny. And like your first sort of instinct is to be like, oh, prove to me it's funny, So that's why you don't editorialize in a query letter, because you don't want to tell someone what to think about your book, especially if the book then doesn't match up to that editorializing. Don't ever use rhetorical questions. Just don't do it. Even if you think you have the best rhetorical question to have ever been written, agents have a knee-jerk reaction to this because we see so many really bad ones and really awkward ones. I was a sales minor in college, and I remember one of the points was don't ever ask a question that someone might be able to say no to, right? So if someone's like, have you ever thought about what it would be like to fly? And the agent can say no to that. That's not going to be a good, you never want to start a sales pitch with a no. And otherwise, like, agents, like I said, just have knee-jerk reactions to them. They don't like them, so don't do it. Don't use a rhetorical question. All right. Some subtler issues. The query makes the book sound unoriginal, and this is often, honestly, a problem with the query. Like, the book itself is not unoriginal, but the way that the query is written makes it seem like 1,000 other books that are out there. On the flip side, giving too many details, like giving me a whole sort of history lesson or whatever, is not really necessary in the query letter. And then you can also give not enough detail. It is a fine balance, and it's not easy to figure out how to do it. But yeah. Genre and category concerns. So these are things like, you said this is magical realism, but there's vampires and werewolves fighting in the streets, and that is clearly textbook urban fantasy, right? And it's like, do you not understand what magical realism is, or are you just trying to not call it urban fantasy because you've heard people don't want urban fantasy, right? So make sure you're like really understanding the genre that you say that you're writing in before you put that on your query letter. The query letter makes it seem like, and so I always like to clarify this is often not a problem with the book, it's a problem with the query letter. The query letter makes it seem like the main character is weak or has no agency. And so this often looks like sentences framed as, Cat is forced to do this thing. Cat is manipulated into doing this thing. And so everything that the main character does is not their own choice. At least that's what the query letter makes it seem like. There's weak writing. So weak writing, just like weak verbs, boring sentences, every word that is used is the most obvious word that could be used. That's what weak writing typically looks like. And this is what happens if you use ChatGPT to write your query letter. This is what's going to happen. Because ChatGPT, what it does is it is putting the next most likely word after next most likely word, and then it's going to read as sort of bland and boring. Unrealistic expectations about the success of your book. If you say something like, my book's the next Harry Potter, or I know that this could be a great Michael Bay movie, or something like that, that indicates to an agent that you might be a little difficult to work with, or something like that. Unprofessionalism. We see query letters all the time where people will comment on the agent's appearance. Don't ever do that. People will put down other books in their genre, or sometimes the whole genre. We get query letters all the time. They're like, oh, I wrote this book because all the other romance books are terrible. And that's just like, it's unprofessional, and it makes me realize that like you don't understand your genre. You don't respect or understand your genre. Underlying isms. These are often where you're just sort of repeating patterns that you have seen done before in media. And so, by isms, I mean like racism, misogyny, ableism, that kind of thing. So like one that's like quite common, and I think people don't realize that they're doing it, is to have a disabled main character whose sole purpose in the story is to motivate our abled main character, or be an inspiration for our abled main character, and they're not really a person outside of that. That's an example of something that you might not even realize that you're doing. Others are sort of the white savior narratives, the fridge women narratives, that kind of thing. Too many cliches. We get a lot of cliched statements. I know I have it in here somewhere. I'm just not sure exactly where it is. But we will get to cliches. So this first pitch here, a poor orphan boy discovers he's the offspring of a legendary character and has incredible power he'll need to defeat a mighty evil. We get query letters that sound like this all the time. There's are sort of generic sounding like this. So I want y'all to tell me in the chat what you think that this pitch might be for. What property do you think this pitch could represent? Yeah. I mean, Devin, you got you got sort of the point there, but specific property. What specific property? It takes a couple seconds for comments to come through on StreamYard. No guesses? All right. So the the answers I'm looking for are it's Star Wars, it's Harry Potter, it's yes. I don't know what Pawn of Prophecy is, but yeah, it's Harry Potter. It's uh what is the Rick Riordan series? Oh, I can't believe I forgot the name of it right now. And the reason why is because it is a chosen one trope, and it is also a sort of hero's journey. It's just like a summary of the hero's journey. But we'll get query letters. Percy Jackson, there we go. Um, Aragorn. Oh yeah, it's been a long time since I read that, but I can see that for sure. Um, we'll get pitches like this all the time in query letters, and the book will be as interesting, as unique as Star Wars or Percy Jackson. But this is what the query letter looks like. So you can see the problem here, right? Where you're not being specific enough, you're not providing specific information. Hercules was Hercules I guess, yeah, well, kind of, yeah. Okay, King Arthur. Okay, so here's another one. A career-focused woman hasn't had time for romance, but her family is insisting on meeting the boyfriend she made up. She convinces her cute coworker to pretend to be her boyfriend for a week. To be clear, this is a sort of tropey thing that I am very much into, but if your query letter looks like this, it's not specific enough, because this could be hundreds of other books out there. This could be half the movies on the Hallmark Channel, right? So we need those specifics to keep us interested and to distinguish your book from all the other books that are out there. It is. And that's what sometimes I describe a query letter, if I'm being sort of my most snarky and I'm with people that I trust and I'm with people that like will take it well, is sometimes I'll say this query letter is just describing the genre to me. This happens quite often in women's fiction query letters, for example. Like the query letter is just describing the genre to me because there aren't enough specifics in it. All right, so let's talk about personalization. In my opinion, personalization is not that important, except when I mentioned earlier, when there's a specific element requested in my wish list, and it makes me give something a little more leeway. I might read a couple more sentences that I might, if there's something that I know that's in it that it's going to make me really interested in it. There are agents who feel differently. There are agents who think, typically sort of the more established agents, who think that every query letter should be like very personalized to them. I think that's too much work. Like you're already doing so much work researching agents and writing your query letter and polishing your query letter. And I think like demanding that every single query letter be hyper specific to me is just not a good use of anyone's time. But like I said, if there is something in my wish list that applies, definitely put it in there. Don't bother though with impersonal and personalization. These are sentences that I feel like writers put in query letters because they know that they're supposed to put personalization in there, but they don't really have anything. And so an example is, you'd be a great match for this book because you like young adult fantasy. And that is the bare minimum. Like you should not be querying someone with a young adult fantasy if they don't like young adult fantasy. So it's sort of like, as you know, Bob dialogue, because we're just telling each other things that we both already know. And things like, I decided to query you after reading your wish list. Another thing that is a bare minimum, just what you're expected to do. You might as well say, I decided to query you because I wrote a book and I want an agent, right? Those are just like understood to be true, and you should not be querying if that is not true. So these are not personalization. They're just taking up space and without really accomplishing anything. So some things to omit from your query. Self-deprecation. I always tell people, how do you expect someone else to believe in your book if it doesn't even seem like you believe in your book? So just cut it out. It's not, I know especially like women are socialized to do this, to like downplay their achievements, and don't do that because the men aren't doing it, I promise you. So don't say things like, oh, it's probably not even that good, or I don't know if you'd be interested, or, things like that. The phrase fiction novel upsets a lot of people because a novel by definition is fiction. That's the definition of novel is it's a long form piece of fiction. So it's like, say, an ATM machine, right? It's just repetitive. The exception, though, you can say science fiction novel because science fiction is the name of the genre. So that's fine, but yeah. Irrelevant personal information. So I think Jay had mentioned earlier, like, if you're a dog trainer and your book has nothing to do with dogs or dog training, then there's no reason to put that in there. Religion, unless it's applicable to the book, there's really no reason to put your religion in a query letter unless it is, unless you're writing for the Christian market or your book is like very focused on religious topics. Same with politics too. Jokes. This may seem kind of silly, but like jokes often fall flat in writing. We know this, right? We know that tone isn't translated very well to writing. And so unless your book is a humor book, obviously if your book is a humor book, there better be jokes in there. But otherwise, leave it out. Jokes about, the agent or the industry or anything like that, just cut it out. There's no reason to put your age in there. People can only, this can only create a bias for you. And so you just want to leave it out. It doesn't matter. Comments about the state of the industry or the market. And this is something that like may seem like it's a good thing to put in there. Like maybe it seems like you're demonstrating how well you know the industry or market. But it's important to remember that the reason why you want to work with an agent is because they are experts in the industry or market. And so there's really no reason to explain to them something that they should already know. How long it took you to write the book. This is another thing that can only bias an agent against you. Because if it took a really long time, the agent's going to be like, oh, do I have to wait another 10 years for their next book? If it took a really short time, then the agent's going to wonder if you really did your due diligence on editing and revising and stuff like that. Publishing credentials that really aren't. And so these are like publishing, these are things like you were published in a website that publishes every single person who submits to them, that kind of thing. A lot of people will say, oh, my Medium article or my Substack article, and those are all self-published. So those aren't really publishing credentials, right? Unless, of course, it went viral, something like that, and then you can put that in there. Too many characters are unfamiliar concept names. It just makes it hard to follow, especially when you're reading quickly. That's why I always recommend 1 to 2 named characters only. If you have a character is important to the plot but can be described in a way that doesn't include their name, I recommend you do that. So like if the main character has a doctor that's important to the plot, you can just call that character like Kat's doctor, right? If the mother does something important to drive the plot forward, you can just say Kat's mother. You can just say the king, right? If they're not a main character, instead of saying the name of the king. And then unfamiliar concept names happens quite a bit in sci-fi fantasy. And so a while back I was helping someone with a query letter, and they had a time travel device in their book that had like, I don't remember the name, but it was like a complicated name. And the name also didn't really imply what it was. And so like, I can't remember it all, so I'm just like making up, but like if it was called like the Thunderbird 3000 or something like that. And in the query letter, we just decided just to call it the time travel device, because then I don't have to remember as I'm reading what Thunderbird 3000 is. I know exactly what a time travel device is, and then I don't have to remember anything new. Some more things to omit: your query history. We don't need to know how many agents you've submitted to. We don't need to know how many agents have requested. It can only bias you. It's not, it's not something that's going to impress us or make us read faster or anything like that. I said editorializing already. Distractions that muddle the message. So a lot of times in queries, you're going to focus on just the main plot of the novel. Sometimes you may put a subplot in there, especially if you're writing mystery thriller and there's a romantic subplot. You're definitely going to want to hint at it, but generally you're going to want to exclude subplots from the query letters. Side characters as well, and weird words are concepts, which I just talked about. Series or sequel info. So publishers are very shy on series right now. They want to buy the first book and see how it does before deciding to commit to a series for the most part. And so if you're like, oh, this is a 7-book series, that may seem like it's a positive, but it might not be, because if we can't sell that first book, then we're not going to be able to sell the other ones, which is another reason why you shouldn't write sequels yet. You shouldn't write the sequels to your first book until you have sort of sold your first book. When I am going out on submission with an author's book, I want them to be working on something different, something new, while we're out on submission, because if the first book doesn't sell, then all the time that you put into the series may be wasted. Oh, I don't have cliches. Okay, so we'll talk about some of the cliches. I thought for sure I had a list of them in here, but some of the cliches that we see in query letters are things like, so-and-so was just an ordinary girl, right? It's a quite common one. And the problem with it is it's just boring and it doesn't tell us anything. And so if you could say something like, so-and-so only cares about her grades and her cat, right? That's something that tells us like a little bit more about the yes, it is very different from self-publishing, but you're not writing a query letter for self-publishing, so that's not what we're talking about today. So something that gives us a glimpse in the main character. So like, is he an ordinary man, or is he a 35-year-old man who eats frozen dinners every night, right? Those are very different things, or they're the same thing, but they have a very different impression. Another one is, the world will never be the same. So what does that mean? Like, I don't know what that means, right? It doesn't mean that stop signs are going to be blue from here on out, because that, then the world's not going to be the same, but that's probably not what you're implying, right? And then what are some others? Get more than they bargained for. That's when you see a lot in query letters. And this is something that we just need more specificity, right? All right. So yeah, I can open up to questions now. I can talk about comp titles if y'all want, or I can open up to questions. I think with the time we can do questions, but if we run out of questions, I can talk about comp titles until the end. So we have any questions about query letters? No questions? Okay, okay, here we go. How many should an author expect to send queries? That's going to vary wildly. There's really no number that can be given. So, for example, if you are writing young adult fantasy, there are probably, I would say, like maybe 200 agents that you could send queries to. If you write military sci-fi, there may be like 30 or 40 agents that you could send to. So it's going to depend on genre a lot. It's going to depend on your querying strategy. So some people like to send just like small batches of queries and see how they do. And those small batches may be different. So for example, the way I fantasy that I mentioned, your first batch may be 30, 40 agents. Whereas if you're doing military sci-fi, your first batch may be like 10, 15 agents, because you don't want to use them all if you realize that there's something like really wrong with your query. So I definitely know authors who have sent 100+ queries for a book, but you may start querying and get very quick responses, and then you don't have to send more. So it varies quite a bit. I don't know anything about lit magazines and short story submissions, so I can't answer that question. That's not my area of expertise. What are some memorable query letters I've read and that stood out, and why? Yeah. Like, so I do have, if you go to my website, Queries, Qualms, and Quirks, all the authors share their query letters, and I do have a Google Doc where you can read all of those successful query letters. Some of them, honestly, aren't even that strong, but the concept itself was really interesting, or the writing was really good. Obviously, I didn't sign any of those, but like the most memorable query letters that I've read, I can't tell you about because we're still on submission with some of their books. So I will say, like, Embroidery of Souls, Ruby Martinez, I specifically remember that query letter being very, very strong. And if you read her back cover copy, it's very similar. The first line was, I can't remember the main character's name right now, but she can kill a man with nothing but needle and thread. So that was like a nice little hook to start us off with. And then it did everything I said here. So it gave us conflict and stakes. It gave us glimpse into the main character's motivations as well. So yeah, I'm trying to remember if there were any from the query letter that were like particularly impressive. I think Angeline Boulley's was pretty good. Angeline Boulley's story itself is just very fascinating. If you listen to any episode of Queries, Qualms, and Quirks, you should definitely listen to that one. If publishers are shying away from series right now, but you have a series, should you only pitch the first book when querying an agent? Not mention the other books unless asked. Yeah, so like I mentioned at the very beginning, the magic words here are it's a standalone with series potential. That way you're sort of indicating that you want to write a series, but the first book does need to stand alone. And Devin is asking what if the first book has a cliffhanger. If the first book has a cliffhanger, then it's not a standalone, and it's going to be very, very, very difficult for you to publish, for you to debut, especially with a book with a cliffhanger that's not a standalone in traditional publishing. Not impossible, of course, if it's like one of the best books that we've ever read, it could happen, but it is very, very difficult. Publishers just aren't really connecting with series right now. The exception, of course, is if we start submitting and there's a lot of interest. That's usually whenever multiple books are sold. So whenever you see those sale announcements that we sold so like my client Liv, we sold their first 3 books in their series. That was because we had like 4 or 5 publishers who were interested. And it didn't end up going to auction, but oftentimes it will go to auction, and that's when you see series announcements. But in this case, we did a preempt, and we actually turned down the first preempt and got a second preempt with more commitment to even more books. So yeah, it's very difficult, and so I always like to make sure writers are like increasing their chances as much as they can. And having a book that ends on a cliffhanger as a debut author in traditional publishing is very, very difficult to get published that way. All right, let's talk about comp titles real quick. We'll see if any questions come in. So comp is short for comparative, but some people may also use the term competitive title. They basically mean the same thing. A comp is a book or other media that's similar to your book in theme, subject matter, atmosphere, plot, or more. My favorite comps are the books that like the reading experience is the same. So like reading this book feels like reading this book. And those are just sort of straight comps. Like, instead of saying, oh, the found family of this book versus, and the, exciting heroine of this book. I love comps that are like reading this book is a similar experience to reading this book, right? That's a personal preference though. It shows someone what to expect from your book without using a lot of words. Don't look at what publishers are doing because they use it to demonstrate potential market size for a book, and they're using different comps from what an author should be using. It's also good for showing that you've read widely in the market. I get query letters all the time still to this day. They're like, this book will appeal to fans of Twilight and Harry Potter. And then the question that pops into my mind immediately is, have you read any other books? Have you heard of any other books? If the only books you name are the biggest ones. So you can say it will have a similar element to your book or appeal to the same audience. So you can say something like the twists and turns of Gone Girl, or you can say something like will appeal to the readers of Nora Roberts. It's two different styles. You can also combine two titles or a title in a different element as well. So Twilight meets Hunger Games, or Mexican Gothic but with aliens. If you have Mexican Gothic but with aliens, please send it to me. You could use memorable characters instead of a book or author. So I know someone who's a New York Times bestselling author who originally pitched not with Game of Thrones as the comp, but with Arya Stark as the comp, which was very effective for her and for her character, because that's saying two very different things. Saying something comps to Arya Stark versus Game of Thrones as a whole, it's saying two very different things. If combining two books, such as a X meets Y situation, they shouldn't be very similar to each other, because then it's like confusing about what you mean. So if you're saying, like, I can't remember, two books that are very similar, I can't remember. So if you're saying like Victoria Aveyard meets Lauren Roberts, they're functionally like they're very, very, very similar books. So I don't know what the meets implies. So that's when you should say it will appeal to readers of Victoria Aveyard and Lauren Roberts, right? Don't use blockbuster books, even though I use those in my examples. I just do that because everyone knows those books, so it's easier to understand. But it both implies that you have unrealistic expectations as to the success of your book, but also demonstrates that you are well read in your genre if you don't use blockbuster titles. If you're still using Gone Girl as a comp, we really question if you've read any other books in the genre. They should be recent, published in the last 5 years, last 3 years if you can. 5 years is a good rule of thumb. Unless you're doing a rewrite or a modern take on an old story. Don't look at what publishers are using. I talked about that already. People always ask, can I use TV shows, movies, video games, comic books? And some agents will say, yeah, no problem, of course. And some agents will say, no, use only books. So if you're going to use a TV show or a movie or any of those other things, and you feel like it's very, very good comp for you and it's very demonstrative, also use a book as well. So the agents that only want books, they will be satisfied if you have a book comp as well. Here's my go-to recommendation for finding comp titles. If you're coming on titles that you feel like are close but aren't quite what you're going for, look up a book on Amazon or Goodreads. Look up that book on Amazon and Goodreads, and look at what in publicity we call it the also bots, right? So people who bought this book also bought this book, or people enjoyed this book also enjoyed this book. Look at those recommendations, and often if you do sort of an iterative process, it will help you find books that maybe weren't on your radar or you didn't think about. Also ask your writing friends. That's one of the best ways to find comp titles. And if you can't find them, don't stress too much about them. People get really, really, really stressed out about finding good comp titles. And I mean, do your best, but don't let it prevent you from querying or anything like that. All right, that's all I have. I have like 1 minute left. But thank you all so much for watching. If you're watching the replay, I probably won't be answering questions. I don't check YouTube comments that often, so just a heads up on that. But you can find the link. Kat's been posting them. So if you go to sarahnfisk.com, that is going to take you directly to my information as an agent, my wish list. I'm open the first 5 days of every month. And then there's also a handout that is a bit.ly link. I can't remember what it is. bit.ly/SNF query, I think. But yeah, thank you so much for hanging out with me. Thanks for asking questions. Thank you, Kat, for putting everything in the chat. And everyone have a good rest of your Saturday. And I'm going to go ahead and just end it. So bye, everybody. Thank you. Have a good day.